Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into the deep socioeconomic roots and honestly, the century-long aftershocks of the French Revolution. We're going to track these massive, turbulent power shifts and see how the fight for equality wasn't just some one-off event. It was much more like a pendulum that kept swinging for literally centuries. Just listen to this chilling warning from 1783. Louis Sebastien Mercier saw it clear as day, right? The wealth disparity was completely unsustainable. We aren't just looking at abstract history here. We're looking at the anatomy of a society stretched to its absolute breaking point. Section 1. The Kingdom of Contradictions. Before the explosion, you've got to understand the immense pressures building up inside Louis XVI's Ancien Regime. Back in the 1770s, you basically had two entirely different Frances. On one hand, you've got this booming, globally connected coastal economy, just generating immense wealth for the bourgeoisie. Ports like Nantes and Bordeaux were exploding, mostly driven by the highly lucrative but brutal transatlantic slave trade in sugar and coffee. But then, on the other hand, you've got this vast, struggling rural interior. It's bogged down by stagnant productivity, endless customs barriers, and these heavy, outdated feudal dues paid to lords who barely even manage their own land. And that brings us to this number, 8 million. Out of a total population of around 28 million, nearly a third of the country was living in absolute, abject poverty. For these millions of wage earners and small peasants, survival literally hinged on the volatile price of grain. I mean, bread was 3/4 of a normal diet. So when the harvests failed, which they kept doing in the 70s and 80s, we're not just talking about inflation, we're talking about sheer starvation. Meanwhile, all that new coastal wealth wasn't even being invested back into productive industry. Instead, we see this system of venal offices. Basically, wealthy people were quite literally buying public and judicial positions straight from the crown just to get social prestige and tax exemptions. By the 1780s, there were over 70,000 of these offices draining productive capital. The state was essentially selling off its own governance just to stay afloat. And as you can imagine, that fueled some massive resentment. Which brings us to Section 2, Sparks of the Revolution. Let's look at how all these systemic pressures finally collided. It wasn't just one single event, right? It was this crazy, volatile mix of high-level political drama and ground-level desperation. First, the finance minister, Jacques Necker, pushes for more representation for the commoners, but the king fires him, which absolutely outrages the public. Then, Mirabeau forms a defiant National Assembly, totally upending the political landscape. But the real catalyst? The ultimate bread motif. Soaring prices and empty markets drove starving citizens into fierce physical revolt by October 1789. And we have to be absolutely clear about who was driving this momentum. Women were not just watching from the sidelines. They were the ones marching on the royal palace at Versailles in 1789 to confront the king face to face. That sparked a massive wave of political activity, from Olympe de Gouges' Declaration of the Rights of Women to radical groups formed by figures like Pauline Léon and Claire Lacombe. And their pressure actually worked. It led to sweeping civil rights victories by 1792, including the legalization of divorce. Moving on to Section 3, the rise of Napoleon. The revolution totally shattered the old absolute monarchy, but the chaos and terror that followed opened the door for one singular military figure. The speed of the shift honestly gives you whiplash. Napoleon Bonaparte seizes power in a 1799 coup, and by 1804, the guy is crowning himself emperor. He stabilized the fractured state using sheer military dominance and highly effective administrative centralization. But of course, boundless ambition led to massive overreach, from the disastrous Russian campaign in 1812, where hundreds of thousands died, to his final defeat at Waterloo in 1815. At home, though, his legacy was all about the Code Napoleon. This comprehensive legal framework cemented certain revolutionary ideals, like guaranteeing equality before the law and protecting private property for men. But for women? Yeah, it was a huge step backward. The code legally stripped them of the freedoms they had literally just fought for, formally institutionalizing their subordinate position to men and making divorce incredibly difficult to get all over again. Section 4, the pendulum of power. So, after Waterloo, you might think France would just settle into some kind of new normal. Well, they didn't. The core issues from 1789 hadn't been resolved at all. Instead, the country spent the next few decades swinging wildly between regimes. We go from restored Bourbon monarchs to a bourgeois king in 1830, to a brief Second Republic in 1848, right into a Second Empire under Napoleon III. And finally, after a devastating war with Prussia, the bloody Paris Commune gives way to the Third Republic in 1871.
And the main reason this pendulum kept swinging so hard is that every single one of these successive regimes structurally excluded vast swaths of the population. The July monarchy empowered the wealthy, but completely alienated the working class. The Second Republic tried universal male suffrage, but moderate Republicans just ended up crushing workers in the streets. The Second Empire relied almost entirely on military prestige. Essentially, every government laid the exact groundwork for the next revolt.
Section 5. The Battle for Equality. For all those crazy regime changes, the fundamental fight for true equality remained deeply unfinished. Think about this. Despite women being the driving force of the early revolution, the Cote Napoleon pushed them right out of the public sphere. It actually took over a century and a half after 1789 for French women to finally secure the basic democratic right to vote in 1945. The revolutionary pendulum had just completely bypassed half the population for generations. But, the fight didn't end at the ballot box. Fast forward to 1971, and we hit this incredibly powerful number, 343. That's the 343 prominent French women who boldly signed a public manifesto admitting they'd had illegal abortions. In a country where the laws threatened severe prison time for that, it was an unbelievably daring act of civil disobedience that completely reignited the modern fight for bodily autonomy. And that revolutionary spirit transitions straight into modern legislative battles. That manifesto led directly to Health Minister Simone Veil championing a liberal abortion law in 1974. The whole political landscape shifted too. A dedicated Ministry of Women's Rights was formed in 1981, and Edith Cresson broke the ultimate glass ceiling as France's first female prime minister in 1991. Today, over 50% of university students are women, which is just a massive stride in education. Yet, looking at the workforce data today, the structural echoes of the past are definitely still visible. Even with all those educational strides, women still comprise around 60% of the unemployed, and pay gaps still persist in comparable professional roles. The old ideals of liberty and equality have continually clashed with the really complex realities of society. All of this leaves us with a pretty profound question. We've tracked this incredibly long arc, from starving peasants and Bourbon kings, all the way to modern legislative battles for parity. So, if a revolution is ultimately measured by the true equality it achieves for all its citizens, when did the French Revolution actually end? Or are the echoes of 1789 still reverberating through the society we live in right now? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. See you next time.